It began as an ordinary afternoon on one of the most glamorous streets in the city, where the polished windows of luxury boutiques gleamed beneath the sunlight. But for one man, stepping inside a particular store would ignite a storm of judgment he never expected. Before he even touched a single item, watchful eyes narrowed, whispers passed, and assumptions were made. He was told, without hesitation, that he did not belong, that his presence itself was a problem. Yet what unfolded next would leave the entire store stunned, shatter stereotypes in an instant, and prove that appearances can be more deceiving than anyone imagined. The man at the center of this story was not new to judgment. In fact, he had grown accustomed to the subtle ways people measured him before they knew him. He was tall, carried himself with quiet confidence, and dressed simply in clothes that did not boast wealth or status. To strangers, he looked like just another passerby. What they could not see was the life he had built behind the surface, a life of hard work, resilience, and success that few could imagine. On this particular afternoon, he decided to walk into one of the city's most exclusive luxury stores, a place known for serving celebrities, executives, and the wealthy elite. The kind of store where security guards stood at the door and sales associates judged who was worth their time the moment they entered. The glass doors opened silently as he stepped inside, the scent of expensive leather and polished wood surrounding him. For him, it was nothing more than a stop along his day. For them, it was an intrusion. The store had always represented more than products. It was a symbol of status, a stage where image mattered more than substance. Every movement inside was deliberate, from the way the staff approached certain customers with smiles to the way they dismissed others with cold stares. And within seconds, he realized he had already been categorized, judged not by who he was, but by what they assumed he was not. What no one in that store knew was that the man they were so quick to dismiss carried a connection to this very place, one that would soon upend every assumption made about him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test dignity, reveal deep prejudice, and ultimately turn judgment into shock. The moment he walked further into the store, it was as if invisible spotlights followed him. A security guard shifted his position, pretending to check something near the entrance but never taking his eyes off him. A sales associate, who just moments before had been speaking warmly to another customer, suddenly stiffened and stepped back as if she had seen something out of place. Another attendant whispered under her breath to a colleague, glancing toward him with the kind of expression reserved for troublemakers rather than customers. He paused by a display case holding watches that shimmered under the light. Their golden surfaces reflected back his calm, unbothered face, but inside he felt the familiar sting of being underestimated. The associate nearest to him moved quickly, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and positioned herself between him and the case as though she were guarding it. "Can I help you?" she asked, but her tone carried less hospitality and more suspicion. It was the kind of question that suggested not an invitation to browse, but a warning that he was being watched. As he stepped away, the sense of hostility only deepened. Another employee circled around, arms crossed, standing close enough to signal that his every movement would be monitored. Customers who had been greeted moments earlier with champagne and smiles were now glancing at him too, sensing the tension in the air. He was, in the unspoken rules of this world, marked as an outsider who had crossed an invisible line. The longer he stayed, the bolder the staff became. One whispered comment grew into two, and soon it was no longer subtle. "Sir, if you are not purchasing, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," one of them said finally, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room. Heads turned. A couple browsing handbags stopped mid-conversation. Another man, clutching a designer coat, looked away awkwardly. Everyone could feel it, the weight of exclusion playing out in real time. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred within him. He had seen this before, in different forms and different places. classrooms where teachers doubted his abilities before he ever spoke, offices where his ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them, social spaces where his presence was tolerated, not welcomed. Yet here, in this store, the assumptions cut more deeply because they were so naked, so unapologetic. He could have walked away. He could have turned, exited through those glass doors, and let them think they had been right about him. But instead, he stood still, his calm expression hiding the storm beneath. The staff had no idea who he was. They had no idea how close they were to a truth that would not just expose their prejudice, but leave them scrambling to reconcile the image they had built of him with the reality they could never have imagined. The tension hung heavy, every second, stretching longer than the last. Employees fidgeted, customers exchanged nervous glances, and the security guard inched closer. The air was thick with judgment, assumptions, and the certainty that he did not belong. Yet in that certainty lay the seed of their undoing, for the moment of truth was approaching, and with it, the collapse of everything they thought they knew about the man they had just tried to push out. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the soft chime of the entrance bell echoed through the store. A man stepped inside, older, composed, and carrying the quiet authority of someone who did not need to announce who he was. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Employees who had been bristling with judgment only moments before straightened their postures, their tones softening into rehearsed politeness. This was the owner, the man whose name was etched in gold on the storefront and whispered with reverence in the world of high fashion. He moved with purpose, scanning the room, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the unusual stiffness in the air. When his gaze landed on the man who had been singled out, something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. Without hesitation, he crossed the polished floor, bypassing every associate who now stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The store employees held their breath, expecting the owner to demand the man's removal, to affirm the suspicions they had, carried so openly. But instead, the room was hit with a moment so shocking that silence fell like a curtain. The owner extended his hand warmly and spoke words that none of them could have predicted. He addressed the man not as a stranger, but as a partner, an equal, someone whose presence carried weight that far exceeded theirs. And then, in a gesture that shattered every false assumption made that day, the owner reached into his pocket and handed him the keys. Not metaphorical keys, but the actual keys to the store itself. The truth landed like a thunderclap. This man was not only welcome here, he was co-owner of the very place they had tried to push him out of. The same staff who had doubted him now stood speechless, caught in the raw exposure of their prejudice. The customers watched in stunned silence, realizing they had just witnessed more than a misunderstanding. They had seen the mask of bias ripped away in real time, replaced by a reality none of them had been prepared to face. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could carry. Employees who had puffed themselves up with authority only minutes earlier now avoided eye contact, their faces flushed with shame. Customers shifted uneasily, realizing they had been witnesses to something far greater than a shopping experience. In that instant, the polished marble floors, the glittering lights, and the air of exclusivity no longer felt glamorous. They felt exposed, revealing how quickly judgment had taken over and how wrong it had been. For the man who had endured their suspicion, there was no need for anger or raised voices. His calm presence was enough. Holding the keys in his hand, he represented something undeniable. The truth that worth cannot be measured by appearances, that dignity remains intact even when others try to strip it away. His silence spoke louder than any confrontation could, and it lingered in the minds of everyone who stood there. The owner's gesture was not only a defense of his partner, but a mirror held up to everyone in the room. It showed that prejudice is not just cruel. It is short-sighted, blind to reality, and often humiliating to those who act upon it. What had begun as an attempt to push a man out of a store ended as a lesson that echoed beyond its walls. As the man walked out later that day, the city lights reflecting off the glass windows behind him, the store itself seemed changed. For those who worked there, the memory of that afternoon would not fade quickly. And for those who heard the story afterward, it became a reminder of how swiftly assumptions can collapse when truth steps into the room. So the question remains, how often do we judge without knowing, assume without understanding, or close doors that were never ours to shut? Because sometimes the very person we push away might be the one holding the keys all along.